Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, Susan is up to the plate, and we're going to look at an article called Some Colleges Don't Produce Big Earners. Are they worth it? It's a Ron Lieber article that appeared August 20th in the New York Times. And then for a question from a listener, 2 listeners sent this question in from Texas, Ari from Texas and Ivan from Texas. And the essence of it said, I'll read the exact wording from Ivan. Love the new format of the show and how it allows for you more depth. I'm wondering, what is your opinion of schools not disclosing their common data sets? As I'm going through the process with my senior, I find it really off-putting when schools are not straightforward. So Lisa and I will talk about why schools do not disclose their data to the common data set, and we will name names. And it is part 3 of a 4-part article I'm doing with Jon Boeckenstedt and the VP of Enrollment at Oregon State University. And we will now turn our attention to higher ed data stories, which is something he produces. I cannot recommend it more highly enough. Susan.
Hey, Mark.
You know, it's just great we've all, over these last 20 years, we always had these really long conversations about college admissions, whether I was in your office or we were in the South Room. And then, of course, we continued it, both serving on a board together in New York. And now we get to do it on the air in front of a lot of listeners. It's just, I look forward to every month when you and I get to chat again.
Oh, I do too. Mark. We should really turn the microphones on earlier, though. When we start talking, because a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, we did our warm-up. This time was a half an hour. Sometimes it's been an hour. We had great conversations about college admissions. And every time Susan and I do that, I'm always thinking, boy, I wish the mic was recording this.
I know. Hey, and we're going to get to see each other in a couple days. Yeah, that'll be wonderful.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Good stuff. All right. So before we dive into what's a really exciting article, boy, Susan and I've asked Susan to lead with our tip. And boy, she shot 3 great tips out. And I was like, we'll save that one for next month and that one for the month after. But I've actually asked Susan to address a tip, which is a question. It's kind of also a question from a listener, one I get pretty frequently, including earlier today. And it has to do with, if I have connections, this is a parent speaking, if I have connections at schools that my kids are applying to or a kid is applying to, when is it appropriate for me to reach out to that trustee member or whoever it is and ask them if they can talk to somebody? And so let's make that our tip, Susan, and share what's on your mind. I remember talking with you about this question back in our Westtown days.
Oh, years ago. Sure. Well, there are a lot of different ways to look at this issue. And when I was at Westtown, I always would say to families, parents of juniors, let's put out on the table if you think you have connections or if you have someone in the wings who might be able to exert some even small influence in the admissions process. It could be faculty members. It could be a relative who's on the administration. It could be a neighbor. It could be a colleague at work. There are lots of ways that parents feel they are connected in a way that could potentially be influential. What I found out is often it wasn't. The parents were hoping there was this potential influence. And when they looked into it, it really didn't turn into much of anything. They would talk to their friend or whoever it was, and the friend would say, I don't really have any influence. There really isn't a way for me to do this. But, backing up from that, what parents have to remember is, first of all, if they feel that they have a string to pull, they need to do it very early. 10th grade. 10th grade, they should be in communication with whoever this person is to say, is there a protocol for this? Is there a procedure that we want to honor your relationship with this particular university? And if the potential recommender does not know the child, this is where that has to be brought into the light, because either the trustee or faculty member is going to say, I can't do this for someone I don't know personally, or they'll say, when can we get together? Before Zoom, this was a lot harder. And
Sure.
now if there's some genuine relationship there, the individual who might potentially write on behalf of the student may indeed say, here's my protocol. And think about this, consider how we might handle this. Some trustees, some faculty members will say, I'd like to see a transcript. I need to know that the student is viable. They're at least going to be in the running, because I would never want to throw my support behind an applicant who isn't even in the ballpark for my institution. And hopefully they would know enough. They generally don't go to admissions like a coach would and ask that question, but they know enough. They know who they're teaching or who's getting in these days to these schools. Then they might, if indeed it looks like the student would be in the running, that the person might say, I need some assurance that this will be an early decision applicant, because I would only put my support behind a student for whom this is a clear first choice. I'm not going to throw my support behind a student who's going to use us, count on my influence, and then turn us down. So I found that to be very common. So again, I think it's just courtesy to the individual for the parent to say, could we talk about this and find out what the parameters are and how, with all respect for you and your position, you would want us to go about this. Truthfully, if the trustee or the alum or the faculty member or the dean or whomever doesn't know the student, it could backfire, because that's a suspect letter of recommendation. When I was in admissions, and this was years ago, we would often say, but we're admitting the student, we're not admitting the parent. Now, in the case of a mega donor, all bets are off. But I'm not really talking about those families. They generally already know what's going on. They have a relationship with the advancement office of that university that has been cultivated for years, possibly a decade or more. This could be a 2-3 generation family with a legacy of giving and attending. I had a number of those families over the year, not as much as some independent schools, but in that case, it's really going to be the advancement office that is going to be connecting and letting a family know how to manage that. It's all very delicate.
No, it is. I remember like it was yesterday, Susan. We were talking about a family that we were working together with, and they told you about this great connection way after the fact, and you were
Yes,
like, why are
indeed.
they telling me this now? They should have played that card a long time ago. And I find that last point you brought up to be so important, and I find a lot of times, and I get a decent amount of this, these requests, the parent is the person who knows the person and don't know the student, and I think that's very risky. I remember
Yes.
when I was in admissions, it was really insulting. In fact, I can remember one time getting a letter of recommendation from a senator, and this is when I was at Westtown, and a certain person whose last name rhymed with bait, so you probably know who that is on the faculty side. They wanted to rip the letter up. They were so insulted because it was like, you could just read it and tell they didn't know the kid. There were references to the parent, and I've heard the kid and that I think that can be very insulting.
I agree. And it shows no effort on the part of the family to put the student out there in a way where the recommendation could actually be grounded in some personal observations. I always go back, and we're talking about a long time ago. Ed Muskie was an alum and a trustee at Bates, and had been governor and then senator, and of course was the elder statesman, not just of the state of Maine, but of the Senate in a lot of ways, ran for president. But he could not say no to anybody who asked him to recommend a student to Bates. And this was before a lot of this stuff was rampant. But Ed Muskie would always close the letter after making some kind of nice observations by saying, if Joey is anything like his father, I would be happy to see him enroll at Bates. And bless his heart, he had a heart bigger than the world. He was a real hero, to many of us. But that was he couldn't say no. And people took advantage of that. But, one year he wrote a letter for the high school kid who mowed his lawn. Literally, that was their relationship. But he'd watched this kid grow up from middle school through high school.
Yeah.
And they kind of became friends in, an uncle-nephew kind of way. And that letter was beautiful. He knew nothing about the kid's academics. This was a small town Maine public high school kid, but he brought that student to life in a way that was insightful and gave us something very different to go on in the application review. And knowing the source, of course, we wanted to honor that, but it was the content of his observations about this young man's character that were profoundly important to us.
Reminds me a little bit of Rebecca Sapke when she talked about the letter from the janitor and how that moved everybody in the admission office and the person got the unanimous vote. I find that, and this is just true for recommendation writers in general, and I look at my own self because occasionally in my CBO role at KIPP, I have to do these. Is the person enthusiastic about wanting to write on your behalf? That's a great test, because when the right kid asks me, I feel I'm complimented that they asked me to do it.
Sure.
When the wrong kid asks me, I'm telling them I think there's probably somebody that could do that would be better for you, that that would know you more. And I think that applies here to, like, if there's somebody and they enthusiastically would want to do it because they know the kid, that to me sort of would be one question that I would have.
Absolutely.
Not just because I know the parent or something.
Where parents get it wrong is they assume that the reputation of the writer of the recommendation.
Okay, Susan, our admissions vernacular, and it is gray zone, and I know you're familiar with this one. So why don't you tell our listeners what the gray zone is?
Well, in a college's applicant pool, there's a middle area where once they read through the applications the first time and they can see which students are clearly destined to be admitted. They have the hooks, they have the grades, the whatever, but they're ranked, they're rated, their academic and personal ratings are way at the top of the pool. And on the other hand, there are kids that are at the bottom of the pool and are very clearly not admissible. Then colleges are left with about 50% of the applicant pool in that middle gray area, meaning that the admissions decision could really go either way. They could be admitted, they could be denied, and they could be waitlisted. And this is where institutional priorities and geographic location and underrepresented kids and all sorts of underrepresented majors, where some kids end up having an advantage that moves them up into the admit category. But colleges first have to figure out how many of those clearly admissible kids are at the top and what the statuses of their institutional priorities.
Yeah, this stuff is complicated, but everybody's doing their best to try to get the right kids at the right school
That's right.
according to their needs. And our big number is 52, and it's going to also be a segue into our article. So, 3 years ago, in an organization called Third Way, which is a center left think tank, they crunched a whole lot of numbers on higher ed institutions, and they found that 52% of schools, which is more than half of the enrollees, were not earning more than the typical high school graduate 6 years after they began their studies. So if they started at age 18, by age 24, they were not earning more than high school. And so,
and now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
that's our number, 52. And that's also a good segue to our article, because we're going to talk about this. So multiple people sent this article in, and the name of the article is called "Some Colleges Don't Produce Big Earners. Are They Worth It?" And the article appeared in the New York Times, and it's by Ron Lieber. And the article appeared on August 24th of 2022, so recently. And so basically, I'll do a brief summary of the article, and then Susan and I will open up for discussion. So a guy named Michael Itzkowitz, who's the author of this Third Way study, he used to be director of the College Scorecard. He did the study, and he found all of these colleges that 6 years in, students were making less than high school graduates were. Now, there's some more data that's important. 10 years out, the figure dropped to 29%. So, 6 years out, 52% were not making more than high school graduates. But when you fast forward and added another 4 years, it was around a quarter were not making more. And so a number of people that sent the article in, it was in the context, oh my goodness, these schools, they seem like they're ripping people off. They're not producing the ROI. And what I like about this article is it really looks at all of the nuance. So what happened was Lieber, he decided to pick 28 of these institutions, and he said he's going to contact them and ask them what's going on with this data. What are your thoughts? And of the 28 that he contacted, just under half of them responded and said that they were, not interested in commenting. But at several other schools, they were willing to engage. And most of them all said to Lieber, they all said, you cannot tell our story in one metric. And so once again, a little bit of background. This is the research is done by Michael Itzkowitz. Itzkowitz. He was the director of the scorecard both in 2015 and 16. And the scorecard, College Scorecard, is a great tool. It's a Department of Education website. If anyone's not familiar with it, we've had it on as a recommended resource multiple times. It's a great place to go and get a lot of real good outcome data. And they've actually made it a lot better now than they used to, because you can look up college graduates by major and compare different schools. But there's information on things like net price, graduation rate, student debt, that kind of thing on the College Scorecard. It's reliable data. So he contacted these schools, and some of them were willing to engage, and they had a lot of very interesting things to say in their response. And so I'll kind of share some things. First of all, if you want to know how much money that is, well, $28,000 was the typical high school graduate. So these students were making under $28,000 was the figure. And so, by the way, Itzkowitz has moved on. He's no longer at College Scorecard. He's now an independent consultant, doing a lot of different things. But so I'm going to mention some of the schools that showed up in the study and some of the responses. So one was the New England Conservatory of Music. 48% of their students were earning less than a high school grad 6 years after. And their associate director, Zach Schwartz, he said in the interview that there's a lot of things to consider. And so here's a quote from him. He says, sometimes it's clear and it's a bad idea financially for a student to matriculate. However, he asks all of his applicants to consider an average boring Tuesday here and compare it to one at a more standard undergraduate institution. He said at our conservatory, they do rehearsals with an orchestra, chamber group, solo practice, instruction, music, and history, and a lot of them find it to be incredibly enriching. They interviewed Grambling State University, historically Black college and university, and they focused on the fact that we're trying to help students that other schools wouldn't serve. And they make the point that just 43% of students who start at Grambling are out earning high school graduates 6 years later. But here's a quote: "Our interest is not getting the elite financially, but getting the students who would not have an opportunity at other institutions." Then Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. I know that's a school you know well, Susan. I remember us having students go there when we worked together.
That's right.
But they their students have a work job, an on-campus labor job, and they engage in a number of things outside of the classroom. And when they talked to Warren Wilson, they were very happy to talk. Jay Roberts didn't shy away from an interview. And what did he said? Here's a quote from him. Dr. Roberts asked that people consider other metrics if they're going to do this. The school, he said, does a much better job on surveys of those who graduate and whether their school prepared them for social and civic engagement. And they do a much better job on the metric of whether they find their work to be meaningful. Another school interviewed was Hampshire College in Amherst. There, 46% of their graduates are out earning high school graduates 6 years out. And they also engaged Dr. Wingenbach. And he said the majority of our students come and leave because they want to be activists, artists, educators, or entrepreneurs. None of those career paths have early income success. He goes on to say Hampshire's surveys of incoming students show that when they're asked to rank their top future values in life, being well off financially ranks 7th. So his point is, according to our own values of our own students, being well off financially is not at the top of their list. He said if anyone's tempted to suggest that this place is full of rich dilettantes, he said 36% of our students come in and they're receiving Pell Grant money to begin with. And so he basically goes on to say, look at our performance in other metrics, and you'll see that our students have tremendous socioeconomic mobility over time. And so it kind of goes on, and I won't mention all the schools that it lists here. But the question I want to ask you, Susan, is when a school is not producing incomes higher than average high school grad 6 years out, is that a reason to automatically dismiss the college, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
Well, as you were walking through the article, Mark, I thought about who graduates from college and doesn't make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately, and I think our listeners are probably doing exactly the same thing, you can start ticking off, teachers, social welfare, human services workers, the backbone of our sociology, basically, in this country, the service occupations that hold us together as a society. These were all the essential workers, by the way, who kept working while many, corporate types, could go home or go remote. There were so many people working at the lower levels of medical care and corrections. And these are the people who sadly earn the lowest salaries, I think, professionally in this country. And do we want to start penalizing the colleges that historically have educated them? That these are people who are values oriented. They've moved into a service occupation. Maybe some of them not so much by choice, but maybe they themselves were from a lower income background and they needed to get out and get a job. They couldn't afford to go to grad school or professional school right away, like a lot of full pay families where they can skip, a lot of affluent families, those kids kind of skip the post-bachelor's degree void and go right to the professional school of law, medicine, business, you name it, nursing, the professions that immediately then deliver higher starting salaries. So in a way, I think we have to look more at who those schools are and what their historical missions are. I mean, if you look at the public universities in this country that are not necessarily the flagships or the STEM heavy schools. Those were the state teacher colleges, right? Looking in, my familiarity in the state of Maine and in the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania still has, the Penn State system, and it has the state system of higher ed, which were all the state teachers colleges. And those are the kids that have gone on to, take care of our children. But we totally diss them. We disrespect them by starting them at these pathetic salaries that aren't sustainable for young people today with the cost of living. So that was the first thing that came to my mind, is that we have to be careful how we judge these schools by this metric. Now, are there some, especially private colleges out there, that are charging, the above $50,000 price tags that then are not delivering the career pathways? But that's more of a student satisfaction issue. Are we talking to those kids, as Ron Lieber would say? Are we looking at how they define success? What is the basic definition of success? I also think of the dichotomy now that we as college counselors are facing between liberal arts colleges and pre-professional colleges and universities. I would consider liberal arts to be pre-professional, by the way. I don't consider them to be not pre-professional, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage of students right now that are comfortable saying they want to go to a liberal arts college and find their direction, that they really need 2 years of exploration and good advising before they declare their major. I mean, when I was in admissions, before I went into school counseling, that's what kids said. And I worked at a liberal arts college that said, well, I might major in English and I might become a journalist, or I might become a teacher, but I really like physics and I might want to do engineering someday. But right now I just want to study undergraduate science, biochem, physics, math, and find my way. Now those are few and far between, and there are an awful lot of liberal arts colleges competing for those kids. And a lot of those schools now have introduced business majors and engineering programs and data science programs. I'm seeing them advertised every day. Schools for whom those programs would have been an anathema a decade ago. They can't afford to do that anymore unless you are, one of the Amherst, Williams, Swarthmore caliber liberal arts colleges that can just say, no, we do what we do, and you're paying for the name on your degree when you graduate, from us.
No, I'm really glad you took the perspective you took, because, regular listeners know I learned a long time ago that I don't like to talk ahead of time and get the perspective that the co-hosts are going to take. I find like just live conversation is the best, because otherwise I use the example of it, be like if you watch the movie one day, then you watch it the second day back to back, it's not quite as fresh. And we've tried that, having these really long conversations, and then as a sort of a preview, then you do it again. So when I come into these, I don't necessarily know what's perspective. That's why sometimes fireworks go off and we get into it. Dave and I kind of got into it last episode a little bit. So,
I can't wait.
Yeah, it's all good. So I completely agree, because the way that I see the public looking at this is those colleges are terrible. They need to close their doors and go out of business. And I feel it's unfair on a number of levels. However, let me say this. That's not to say that there should be no accountability. That's not to say this can't even be one metric.
Right.
Not against using it as a metric, but it's not the be all and end all. And the thought that popped in my head was, let's say that I'm an SAT tutor. Okay. And I work for a boss, and he wants to see, the students that I work with getting a 1400 on the SAT. Well, it's not fair to judge me by one student who came in with a 1350 PSAT compared to someone else who's coming in with an 800 PSAT. That's not fair. to judge me by that metric. And that's kind of what it reminds me if we're going to take this one metric, because we as an institution chose to take on this other student. Maybe, maybe they had, different learning differences and challenges, maybe more troubled background, whatever it is. They have so much further to go to get from that 800 up to that 1400.
That's right.
And that's kind of what, we're doing if we just use one metric, because the most selective schools, they are coming in with students that are at a higher level. They're at a higher level. They have better family connections and family networks. And so, I just think that gets lost. And I also see this get lost with community colleges. A lot of times people will just disparage community colleges because they don't have high graduation rates. And they don't realize that it's not fair to compare a student coming from a college-educated family where money's not an issue, that goes and lives in a residential environment and a school with a lot of resources and a family a lot of resources, with a 34-year-old, mom who's an Amazon delivery person while they also work for DoorDash, and they have 2 or 3 kids, and they're going to school part-time. Those are apples and oranges, and you're going to have different graduation rates. I find the CSUs get a bad rap for this. In California, their graduation rates don't wow you, but look at how many non-traditional students they have. And so some of it's money, some of it is, are you going full-time or part-time? Some of it is, are you first gen?
Right.
And versus, have you had models of what it's like? Both my parents were college graduates. I never for one second in my life can ever remember not having the thought that I would ever go to college or that I would ever not graduate. I don't remember that thought even popping in my head for 1 second. I may not go or I may not graduate, because that model had just been set for me.
That's right.
But then when I've worked with some other students, I've just seen the impediments that they have, and whether it's, I got to go help my mom and stop and work because she can't pay bills or whatever. And so I think that one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this article is because I think it gives us an opportunity to push back at using a simple metric like that. And then another thing is, okay, it sounds bad, 52% not making more than high school, but that was 6 years out.
Yes.
By 10 years out, so let's say you're 28, now more than 70% are making more. Who knows what it was 15 or 20 years out? It may be an 85 or 90%. Then you get into all the other aspects of how college can develop you. This is one thing that Dave likes to talk about a lot, is that we've gotten into the point where everything's just transactional. But there is a tremendous amount of personal growth and finding yourself and meeting new interesting people that shape your life. There's all of those other aspects of college that you can't just strictly quantify by how much does somebody make, and that's the sole metric.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so I wanted to take this article more to push back against what I see as just an overly simplified way of judging colleges. And you brought up a lot of good points, in addition to the ones I brought up about, like, if you're producing a lot of people going into service professions, then you can't be expected to make the same. Like, anytime you take a look at those lists, colleges that have the highest paid salaries, they're pretty much STEM schools. They're your Harvey Mudds and your RPIs and your Illinois Institute of Technologies, and then your Georgia Techs, your MIT. I mean, they don't even have to be your biggest brand names of the brand names, but they're people that are going into those tech jobs, which certainly pay more coming right out of college. And so I just think that's an important component to add to the conversation. So
yep.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, Susan.
Well, I liked Lieber's comment that research shows that by age 40, people who choose liberal arts degrees often see their incomes catch up to those who majored in STEM. And there is no doubt that starting salaries in STEM, and perhaps in some business fields too, are going to be higher. I have twins, and one of them was in an RN, a BSN program, direct entry nursing program at a high-end university. And in his first year in the profession, is making more than his mother ever made as a school counselor or an admissions officer halfway through her career. But because there's a defined skill set in most STEM fields and a demand.
Sure.
So the magic combination of college programs that can prepare young people with a skill set in that short amount of time, but they are immediately employable. Couple that with an enormous demand. The other twin was a classic liberal arts student who studied broadly, kept adding minors, ended up with really 3 or 4 degrees because of her broad interests and her lack of gravitation to a career field. So she used her undergraduate education more to explore and enrich her preparation for a lifetime of employment. There were 2 completely different models. One very much a Gen Z, and one very much kind of a throwback to a millennial. Right? Interesting, that if you look at the characteristics of those. Now, who's making a lot of money and who's not making a lot of money? We that's very obvious. But I have no doubt that the trajectory is going to end up being more similar than dissimilar as time passes. And for me, you've got to look at the child. And I think parents out there who are listening to this is really your takeaway, is you have to look at the child, their learning style, their not just their hopes for the immediate post-college experience, but what is their value structure that's going to guide them through a lifetime of learning and employment. The generation that's in college right now they care a lot about return on investment, but they also care a lot about social values and they're unselfishly motivated. There's this dichotomy right now of I want my education to pay, especially if I'm going to get an expensive education.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's not just about me.
If for those of you listeners who never heard Interview 96 with Scott Muir, I'd recommend it. So Scott is a podcast listener and reached out, and he works for a project called Study the Humanities. And I did an interview with him on debunking myths about the humanities, and he's actually employed by the National Humanities Alliance. But special project he's working on, Study the Humanities, looks at all of these things, and he shared a lot of the research. What does the research show? Same thing Susan was saying about how mid-career people in humanities often do just as well. If you're looking at things of the financial metric, and I think that we can't emphasize enough that letting your kid chart their own path and pursue what they love. Because a lot of times when you pursue what you love, even if you're in a lower paid profession, you'll rise to the top because, you'll be good at it and you'll love it and you'll put the work in because it'll be fun and rewarding to you. I mean, there's a person, and, you've Susan, you've worked with hundreds of them. There's a person that goes into business and wants to do the whole Wall Street thing and whatever it is, whether it's private equity or hedge funds, whatever it is. And there's a person that just loves that and just feeds off that energy, and they're like a fish in water doing that. And then there's another person that does that and hates it and can't barely stand it. I'm making crazy money, but gee, I'm working 90 to 100 hours with this Wall Street grind, and I hate my job. I hate my life. And what's the difference between the two? Well, one person was doing what they loved. And nothing is wrong with the family on the other hand saying to me, if you're going to go into a profession that's, much lower paying, then I'm not paying $85,000 or $90,000.
Right.
I don't think that's wrong either. So I don't want to, act like we're sort of advocating sort of this pie in the sky quixotic worldview, right? Like I don't have a problem, with that either.
That was a point, Mark, that I wanted to be sure we brought up today because, as parents look at return on investment, there is some wisdom in saying if my child is aiming at a bachelor's degree in a professional field,
Mm-hmm.
then paying the $50,000 to $80,000 a year might be worth it because they won't have to go right to graduate school to get a good job, or they might never have to go to graduate school. Or if they go, they can go later in life when their corporation or their hospital or somebody else is going to pay for it. But if your student is truly undecided and needs a couple of years to do liberal arts, whatever they want to do, explore, experiment, then there's some parent wisdom in saying, don't borrow a lot. Don't go into huge debt for that. Go affordable. I mean, I believe you shouldn't go into huge debt for anything, right? There are too many great options in this country that you don't have to go beyond the federal loan programs, right? But then think about a lower cost option if what your student needs is that period of time to explore. But shop wisely, as Ron Lieber says. Shop wisely for that school, and make sure that that college that will that's really what they do. That's their mission. That your student's not going to be like an also ran and not get the attention of the faculty because they don't know what they're doing. They're actually committed mission-wise to helping that student find his or her gifts and move to the next level. And there are a lot of schools that, and then they say, let's talk about not just your major, but your career path but root it in your child's gifts and interests. We did that article a month or two ago on follow your passions. And we redefined that away from the word passion to the do what you are model, which is, what are the child's gifts? And parents, again, there are a lot of great resources for helping students think about that, especially if they are really undecided or they're grasping at straws. And you see them saying, well, I guess I'll just apply to business because that's the default. Well, no. It's very competitive, and maybe 20 years ago it was where you went if you weren't good at English or writing and critical thinking. Not anymore. Not anymore. But use science. Use do what you are. Find out what your high school offers as part of their guidance program for helping kids put words and to their feelings and to their sense of what they are good at and might want to study more.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up question, Susan. Navient has some tools in that regard. What are your thoughts on them? Do you like their tools that they offer, or do you think there's a lot better stuff out there?
Oh boy. Well, my experience with Naviance is a little dated, Mark.
Okay.
When I used it, I used their self-assessment tool, which was Do What You Are. I don't know if that's not using it now.
Sure. That's a fair answer.
I know that SCORE, which is now the college guidance and application platform that many high schools in the country and around the world use, SCORE is affiliated with UScience.
Mm-hmm.
So any of your kids out there, parents who SCORE is that platform that they're going to be using, gets a free UScience account.
And we're huge fans of UScience. I know Susan likes it. I like it. Lisa loves it as a psychologist. It's funny, at the NCAN conference, which I just recently attended, I got to spend a lot of time with a top SCORE person that came over from UScience to SCORE, talking with them about these exact things. So your timing of that is apropos. So I'm actually really excited about what's going on with the partnership between the whole rebranding of the coalition, basically, with what's going on with Technolutions and SCORE and the coalition. I got to spend some real good time with a former Caltech admission officer for quite some time that's now leading up what coalition is doing. And he brought up a lot of really good points. He says, people like to criticize coalition, but he talked about healthy competition is good.
Yep.
And he pointed out all the ways in which Common App has changed. With that, the change in the discipline question that you saw recently, the change in the that right on a topic of your choice, that question. I mean, that came from coalition and quite a few other things as well. The fee waivers, the changes in fee waivers, all those things were sort of pushed by coalition's emphasis on access. So, for the coalition bashers, some healthy competition can really make other platforms better. But that's another topic for another day. But Susan, we did something I didn't think we were capable of doing, and in the news in under 45 minutes, including our preamble.
Yay!
We can do it.
It was a short article, Mark. A good one. A good one, and very data rich with some great resources. So I think there are a lot of parents out there who could get a lot out of this college scorecard and out of some of Ron Lieber's other financial resources.
Yeah, and next month, Susan and I are going to be talking about some tips if you're interested in looking at business schools. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next month for that one, Susan. Thank you.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it, Mark.
Thanks.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Lisa, I had to come up with another what would surprise you as I interact with these admissions people.
That does not surprise me at all.
This one's hot off the press. It actually came from a conversation I had today with a very senior admissions person, director. And it's how hard the pandemic was on admission officers. And that might surprise people. Maybe it won't. And one of the reasons it was hard, a lot of not all, but a lot of admission officers are extroverts. So they found it incredibly hard, talking with her this morning, not doing the travel, not having any travel, brutal. Being in their home all the time, brutal. As they said to me, all the things that I liked about the job I didn't get to do. And now, not all. Like you think, well, they're pressing the flesh, they're in all these fairs. I surprisingly meet more introverts than you would think for a job that's so public facing. There is, I think, a higher percentage of introverts in the field than people may think, at least self-described. But I think that's just something that may surprise you. Like I'm finding that people are still just recovering. And one thing they're loving is finally getting some sense of normalcy now and getting back on the road and all that. So it's like, I know for me, the single hardest part for me about the pandemic was not being able to hit the road.
Yeah, no, I think that's true for a lot of people. And I just think it was such an abrupt change of how they had to do things. Like, that's so stressful.
Yeah.
And then you're locked in your house, and depending how the weather was. I mean, in Illinois, that spring of 2020 was just horrific. It was just 42 degrees and rainy every single day for months, it felt like, or for years.
Well, you bring a good point up, because the other thing was when you're in senior level leadership, like you're largely responsible for those numbers. Mm-hmm. And then you have the budget dependent on you. If you're a school that's just making it, literally, whether you can pay faculty or layoffs may depend on how good of a job you do. If you're more selective, the issue is not necessarily are you going to be full, but it's going to be, are all the people that are watching those numbers like a hawk, how are they going to be happy with us when we can't travel and people can't come see us? So how can we possibly do well? And a lot of schools did end up doing well, surprisingly, but you can imagine how that compound the stress.
Mm-hmm,
the stress piece of that.
Yeah.
That's. Anyway, let's talk about other stuff. So we have a couple really good questions today. Well, one question today, and then we'll see how far we get.
Okay, yeah. We always tend to be overambitious, but...
yeah, I know. So that's why I'm trying not to even tell people ahead of time what the question would be. We just record it, and when we run out of juice, we move to the next question.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, take it away.
This is a really good question that I also think about, and it's from Ivan from Texas. And Ivan says, "Hi, Mark. Love the new format of the show and how it allows for more depth. I am wondering what your opinion is of schools not disclosing their common data sets. As I'm going through the process with my rising senior, I find it really off-putting when schools are not straightforward."
Yeah, this is actually a fantastic question. And for those who are not familiar, I think it's important that I do talk a little bit about what common data set. It's funny how data, that's one of those words. You say data, I say data. You say tomato, I say tomato, right? So you're like I'm like data, you're data, whatever. So common data set, it's interesting. It hasn't been around forever. I'm not sure the exact year it started, but I remember having conversations when we had Peter Van Buskirk on the podcast way back in the day, and he left VP of Franklin and Marshall in early 2000. I was having a conversation with him offline about how much better it is for for reporting data and not having fabrications since Common Data Set came around. So what is Common Data Set? Well, it's a project by the Common Data Set Initiative that is in place, and it is designed basically to ensure that the public has accurate data about college and that it is delivered in a systematic way. So it brings together, a bunch of people. It is with guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. Three of the main people who are attributed for being on the publishing side are the College Board, U.S. News, and Peterson's. But it is a brainchild of the Common Data Set Initiative. And so you have this voluminous amounts of incredibly impactful data that is, if you're not familiar with it, you really, really need to look into it. There's not one place you can go, like commondataset.org, and get all of this stuff. There's two ways to get it, really. You can just Google name of school Common Data Set. It'll pull up a link. Or most of the time, it is on the institutional research page for most colleges. If you want to go to name of college, almost every college, I don't know of one that doesn't, but I never want to say never, has institutional researchers in a research section of their website where they'll publish survey data and a lot of other really helpful stuff. You need to check it out for any colleges you're interested in. So you can also just Google name of college you're interested in, institutional research, go right to that section, and then you'll see links. And I'm going to actually go into it a little bit because I think it'll be helpful for people to know what's in there. So, and it's great because this is standardized data and it's reliable data. So it's usually a year behind, like the new stuff just came out for the college sophomore class, right? Class of 2025 or 2021, depending if you're going to high school or college. So I wish it could be more current, like current year, but it's like legs about a year behind. So Section A is general information, and there you get information on the type of college, public or private, single gender co-ed, degrees offered, that kind of stuff, and then contact information. College B is really great. That's got enrollment and persistence data, number of students, broken down by different demographic groups, and then how many of those students go on to complete degrees. For those of you who are in an admissions mindset, first-year admissions, freshman admissions, you're definitely going to want to go to Section C. That's where you get information on applicants. You get admission statistics, like how many people applied, how many were accepted, how many were enrolled, what factors schools use, criteria that they use to determine who they admit, whether it's very important, not important. And then you get stuff like test score data, GPA data, really a lot of rich data in that section. For those of you who are kind of in an admissions mode, if there was one section I would have you look at, it would be Section C, freshman admissions. But Section B, enrollment data, is also really, really interesting if you want to see who's in the school already. Now, I'll tell you an example of how I use Section D literally day before yesterday. So Section D is transfer data. So I'm working with this transfer student. I'm on here with him and his mom on a call, and Zoom call, and he's like, I'd like to talk about the possibility of transferring to Harvard. Okay, big gulp in my throat, because that's one of the hardest schools to transfer into. But instead of me just telling him, Harvard is incredibly hard to transfer into. It actually has a lower transfer acceptance rate than it does for freshmen.
That's hardly mathematical possible.
It is. So I pulled up the data. I pulled up the data, and he saw it. And so Harvard had over 1,000 males that tried to transfer last year. They took 10, and they had 960 something. I think it was 67. I know it was in the 960s. Women, because the data is broken down by gender. And six got in out of over 960. So then he was ready to move off of Harvard.
Yeah.
So it's like the data is really powerful that way. So that's Section D. And then Section E has all your academic offerings and your policies. You can see special academic programs. You can see honors programs, study abroad programs. Has the breadth of the academic information there, graduation stuff as well. F is rich because it's student life. It's like housing and a breakdown by age, residency, and things like that. And Section G has all the expenses, costs to attend, tuition, room and board, fees. H I love to use a lot. That's your financial data. How many students get money, student loans, debt, requirements for aid. It can show how much need-based aid, how much merit-based aid, and a lot of really rich data there, in there, including people that that get merit-based data and they don't qualify for need-based. I mean, it's really good. And then you have your class size and faculty information in I, and then more like discipline areas and degrees conferred in J. So that's kind of an overview of the data. And so for anybody who's discovered this, you realize this is a gold mine. Do you remember, like, Lisa, like the first time you found this treasure
yeah.
trove?
I mean, it's just like, it takes a little bit of getting used to know where to look for things. But once you do, it gives you so much more information, and information is really power about decision making. And, for instance, like I had students who wanted to do wait lists at certain schools, and I was able to go into the common data set and say, well, this school takes X% off their wait list. This school doesn't take anybody off their wait list. And it really helps you make some good decisions when you have that information. And I don't think most people know it's readily available.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, like for people who find it a little cumbersome, I mean, you're not getting your bells and whistles here. There's no color-coded graphs, charts. And for some people, they just find it a bit tedious. Other sources have the data. They just take it from there, right? Like if you go to collegedata.com, if you go to College Navigator, if you go to Big Future, they're using common data set data and just uploading it. So sometimes, even like myself, I don't always feel like going there. Sometimes I just go to the quick shortcuts, especially if I want to look up like for a bunch of schools. Then if I want to look up one school, I'll usually go to Common Data Set. If I want to look up information on like 8-10 schools quickly, I'll go to a source like College Navigator or Data, College Data that has all the exact same data, just upload it. So that's a little bit about the information. So then the question is, like, does everybody produce this, publish it? The answer is no. Does almost everybody publish it? The answer is yes. I have heard from credible source that there are 12 schools as of last year that were not publishing it. The data. And I know that number is going down now because there's some watchdog organizations that are pushing these schools. And the question, didn't the question specifically point out Columbia or Chicago? I'm trying to remember.
It did not absolutely not say that, but
okay. So I had some communication with Ivan outside of just this question coming in, and I know he was concerned about like Chicago and Columbia, for example. Well, first of all, I do have some good news. Thanks a lot to the work from Michael Thaddeus, the Columbia professor that we've talked about a lot, that blew the whistle on Columbia. Columbia's provost came out in June with a really, really, clear, unapologetic announcement. Mary Boyce announces that we will be releasing 2 common data sets. They'll release it for the Columbia College and for Columbia Engineering. That was in June. And then actually just in September, it came out. So now Columbia is off the list. And I think that's largely because of Michael Thaddeus and the pressure he was putting on them to be more transparent. So Columbia is now off the list of schools that are sharing. Guess what? University of Chicago, another big culprit that has hidden their data, has decided that has gone public with the fact that they will be releasing their data. Another school that had been hiding their data that's come out and said they're releasing their data this fall, Boston College. I think some of this is a response to all the work Thaddeus did. I really do.
Well, yeah, and did you see, and this article just came out this week, it's by Ron Lieber in the New York Times, and he talks about this issue, and he goes and calls up the University of Chicago and shakes them down. So he describes how he shook down Bentley, and now Bentley's publishing it. But there are some schools that still were just like, no, sorry, we're not doing it.
Yeah, he was one of the reporters that was, I never mentioned my name, but he's one of the watchdog people out here pushing for transparency, especially around money. And some of the schools that are still not producing it, Emerson College is being very defiant. They're absolutely not proprietary data. We're not going to share it. And then some of the others I know that are not include High Point and Albright.
Yes.
So let's talk about why would somebody not share their data? Well, the only excuse I've heard these schools use, and I'll just be upfront, I think it's bogus, but they say that it is laborious, it is time, consuming. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of things that their researchers need to do. And they say, we just think, they can be spending their time doing other things. And so that's the only excuse that I've even heard proffered by someone that hasn't shared their data, other than just people coming out and just saying it's proprietary. We do it for our own purposes. But to me that's a problem. That like because the purpose of this whole initiative is to help shed more transparency on what's happening at colleges. So I just personally have a problem with schools saying, no, we're not going to let you know what's really going on. Because I've never even heard any other excuse used other than it's a lot of time, it's really time consuming, and we're the one paying our researchers to put all of it together, and we'd rather have them do something else, or it's proprietary. But why would something that the public finds so helpful to understand the process, why would you shield that from people?
Yeah.
Like I really honestly cannot think of a justifiable reason. So to me, it's a real problem.
Yeah. I don't know if I told you this, but before I went to grad school, I worked for 2 years as a paralegal, a corporate litigation paralegal in Chicago. Yeah. But anyway, I learned, number one, that I should never be a lawyer. But number two, I also learned the following, and I think this is true. Like, if you are doing legal good things, and you should keep excellent records, you should make them public. But if you're doing bad things, you shouldn't write anything down. And so when schools will not, like when High Point doesn't want to release their information, it kind of makes me wonder, like, that's weird. I wonder what's going on there that you don't want me to know. Right. And it's just kind
I agree 100%.
It casts a little like suspicious shadow on it for me.
Well, look at Columbia. We see all the stuff that was going on with them.
Yeah, we now know why.
And they didn't want that to come into light. So I personally think it's unjustifiable, and I cannot substantiate any positive reason to not share your data when more knowledge just helps the public to understand a lot of things about your school. And so if you're looking for a magic bullet, like, oh, that's the reason, that makes so much sense, I don't have it. And I think the fact that such a small number of schools are doing that speaks volumes. And I would personally say, if you're someone interested, in the past I would have said that to all those schools I mentioned, but fortunately Chicago, Boston College, and Columbia are three of the more well-known schools that are publishing now. But for Emerson, Albright, High Point, I would ask them if I'm in admissions. I would actually ask them, was there a reason why I don't see this data from you? I see it from all your competitors. Because one thing I've learned is that, what gets inspected gets expected.
I love that.
I wish I could say I made it up, but it didn't.
Whoever
Stealing,
did,
borrowing.
fabulous.
Yeah. But it's true. And in other words, if these schools all felt like families were going to call them on the carpet and were going to demand it, then I feel very confidently they would change. And I think a lot of the pressure from people like Lieber and others is why you see and Thaddeus, why you see the Chicagos and the Columbias and the Boston College. Like Boston College and Chicago and Columbia were not producing this data. Go back and look. You won't see it. This is new commitments that they're making to share the data.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that, I think if a student just didn't want to disclose their transcript to them, they would have a problem with that. But it's sort of like the same thing. So I feel like, if you're giving them all your information, then why are they not giving you all their information? There's like an equity issue there. And so I think people should demand it.
You know what it reminds me? So when we were doing boarding school admissions, one of the things, and you see a lot of colleges do this as well, they would allow students to have an overnight experience. You normally see it with colleges. Sometimes it's part of admitted student visit days. Sometimes it's part of like fly-in programs. Sometimes it's special programming sometimes schools just offer it. It tends to be smaller schools, more residential. And I used to tell everybody, like, hey, if you're going to stay at a place for 4 years, try it for a night, see what it's like. And within the boarding school admissions community, it was highly controversial because a lot of people are like, I'm not having somebody come in here after I spent all the time recruiting and whatever. Some 17-year-old walks up to them and says, this place sucks, don't come here. And all my work goes down like a deck of cards. But I would be like, what do you have to hide? Like, if you believe in your school, you should want people to see your school and experience what it would be like. Mm-hmm. And the same, like I said, a lot of college programs have programs like that where you come, especially a lot of these fly-in programs, you stay in the dorms. But then some people don't want to do it. And to me, things like that are concerning when you don't want to let the hood be lifted up and let people see what's under there. So I think we agree, Lisa.
Yes.
And there's no justifiable reason. But I'll tell you what, I think this is an important enough topic that we should come back and call out anybody else that's not sharing their data that we didn't list today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And name names so that people can ask schools and hold them accountable.
Yeah, and I think it'll be very interesting to look at that University of Chicago data and see how it compares to what they've reported, because I don't know. I went there and I know how they're ranked, and I'm just going to guess that some things are a little off. So
coming out pulling punches, Lisa.
I'm sorry, but I think their marketing department is way ahead of reality. Let's put it that way.
You think Columbia Part 2?
Yeah, I think it's Columbia Part 2. Now, maybe the University of Chicago, like, data people are a little bit better at hiding stuff. I mean, Columbia just straight up lied, I mean, so.
It just shows that they, felt they could get away with it. But also, once again, they weren't letting this data set out there.
Right, because that would be a very easy way to check. I mean, the math professor, he had access to internal information, and he had like the skills to tabulate that all and compare it. And, that's not your average parent. So,
I mean, I'm a kind of a nerd geek when it comes to numbers, so I geek out on this stuff. I don't see what is in common data set that the public can't see. Like, what is in there? There's more confidential stuff if you look at 990s, which nonprofits have to file, where you can go in there and see the salaries of everybody, for public institutions. That's a lot more sort of, they don't have a choice. It's part of filing requirements for being, nonprofit public institutions, but and private institutions as well. You can get it for them as well. That those filings, they're but they don't have a choice about that. But the point is, there's other stuff out there like that salary data that's available that you can see that to me is a lot more confidential than this. This is just, I don't know. Anyway, we've beaten it up enough. It really grinds my gears, and so I don't want to let it go because I don't feel like I've punched it in the face hard enough.
I know. Like, your anger has not been fully. I totally get that. It's not been fully.
I'm being a little restrained. Yeah. This would have been a great grinding my gears topic.
Well, I have a feeling it's going to come up again. So I think you'll get that.
Especially as I learn more. Well, I've heard there are 12 schools that were not doing this, and now we're down to like 8 or 7, and I'm determined. I don't know every single one of them. I mentioned the ones that I know of that aren't doing it, and the ones that recently flipped. So I'm a little bit on a mission. I tried to do a little digging around and I was hoping to come prepared to name every single name today, but I think I got more than half of them.
All right,
the ones that either weren't. So you're right. As I learn more, or if any of our listeners know of anybody that's not sharing their common data set, send it in to us, and we'll call them out on the air.
Yeah, Mark Stucker's got his eyes on you people. So
you think you're right behind me.
That's right.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
It is part 3 of a 4-part article I'm doing with Jon Boeckenstedt and the VP of Enrollment at Oregon State University. And we will now turn our attention to higher ed data stories, which is something he produces. I cannot recommend it more highly enough. Talk to us about higher ed data stories, which is just a treasure trove. Where the idea come from? What is it that makes the data and the presentation of the data, so powerful? I'm sure you know this, but a lot of other VPs of enrollments, deans, associate deans, they absolutely love this. And really any sort of admissions junkies or people that really want to do a deep dive that are familiar with it as a resource find it to be unlike anything else out there. So talk to us about the idea, where it came from, and what makes it special.
Sure. Well, I was an English major in college, and I took my required statistics courses and other sorts of things, but I never really loved math for its own sake. And in one of my first, admissions job, one of my first tasks was to do what we call the funnel analysis, to take a look at how students moved from inquiry or search name even to inquiry to applicant to admit to enrolled student. And this will surprise some of your listeners, I assume, but in my first admissions job, I didn't have a computer. In fact, there was one terminal in our office that went into the mainframe computer that was shared by 3 different colleges. And any report you had to run had to be run overnight when people weren't on the system. Right. So, and only that one person was allowed to sit at that computer and touch it. It was like a sacred thing. So, I mean, that's how far we've come in my career. So my first funnel analysis was done using index cards, 3x5 index cards, and green bar paper that you used to see on those printers. So you could get a nice, wide sheet of paper about 18 inches wide with lines across it. And I just started tallying things by hand with a pencil and paper and a calculator, right? So I had if I was calculating the average ACT score, I took a look at the students with the 27, multiplied how many there were, added it to the number, and then divided by the total number of students, right? So doing all that was kind of cumbersome and tedious, but it started showing me patterns in the data that I might not otherwise have an opportunity to see. And it really sort of made me intrigued by the patterns in the information and the data that we use out there. And there is a guy named Tom Mortensen, who I think still lives in Iowa City, Iowa. I think he was connected to the University of Iowa. In the, I think, 90s, he started publishing a little black and white flyer called Post-Secondary Opportunity. And it would have what in the day were probably pretty good charts using iPads and other sorts of data, but today are just horrible black and white charts with no nuance or nothing to them. And I remember one issue especially was called Higher Education's Gated Communities. And he looked at Pell Grant participation rates and state funding for public institutions and other sorts of things. And it was just like, a bomb went off in my head. I said, oh my gosh, this is something that nobody knows about. And here it is on a sheet of paper for everyone to look at. So fast forward, 20 years or so, and this has always been on my mind. And I come across a software called Tableau software, which allows you to interact with your data in really cool and interesting ways. And then they allowed you to publish it on a blog. And I knew right away, I said, this is something I have to do. So I started playing with the data, started trying to figure out what topics every week. I mean, kind of like you, trying to figure out what the next topic for your podcast is.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Downloading the data, taking a look at it, and then figuring out how to present it in a way that would be interesting to readers. And so I just looked at the statistics just this morning, and in the 7 or 8 years, I've had 1.5 million hits on the blog, which I think is, not great. It's not like Huffington Post, right? But I think it's pretty good for a guy who just does it sort of on a volunteer basis occasionally whenever the urge strikes me. And sometimes I'll do it because I'm interested in the topic, and sometimes I'll do it because something I read in the media really annoys me. And so I'll go to the data and see if I can debunk what I've been reading in the newspapers lately.
No. And it's great. And I'm just going to share with our listeners sort of some of the cutting edge topics that Jon, takes this data and visually presents it so you can see. So recently, does the admission process favor men? That's one. Abortion policy and freshman migration. Very interesting. A look at transfers, changing shape of higher American educational enrollment. It just goes on and on. Rankings and economic mobility. There's data on yield rate. You've done stuff on flagships versus land grant schools. What's the difference? One we referred to earlier, 3 ways of looking at graduation rates, 2020 data. Lots of stuff on test scores. I know that's been a passion of yours. You and Akil Bello may be sort of the 2 most prominent people on the national. Well, no, how can we forget Schaefer?
Right.
When it comes to sort of egregious misuse of test scores, you've been really outspoken on that. And it just goes on and on. You look at education and election results. I mean, real cutting edge stuff. So, and then highly rejective colleges. You did some real good stuff on that. So what are a few of the stories you've explored? And when you've got into the data, you found that, wow, what the data is showing is really different than what the public perception is out there?
Yeah, I will tell you, I'll start with my favorite blog post of all time. And if you want, I'll send you the link and you can share it with your readers. It's
Please
about
do. We'll put it in the show notes.
It's about educational attainment in the United States. And the reason it's my favorite one is because the first time I looked at it, I thought I had made some sort of dumb mistake in analyzing the data, right? So I'm going to ask you a question, Mark. I'm going to put you on the spot.
That's okay.
In 1940,
Mm-hmm.
the year 1940, so, pre-World War II, what percentage of adults over 25 in America had a college degree or more?
8%?
3 to 4%. And then World War II happened, and the GI Bill, which I've recently discovered was not applied equally to all people, unfortunately, and is a whole other story into and of itself. But even though that's true, it did ramp up educational attainment in the U.S. to where we're now at, something like 36 or 37%. And it put everything I knew in context about, colleges suddenly enrolling students who didn't have a birthright of going to college, right? I thought that was really compelling. It put my own parents in context. When I looked at the data, I said, my gosh, most of their peers didn't go to high school. I mean, that was astonishing to me. And I could not believe how much America had changed in 80 years. And so that was the one that I come back to all the time as my, I guess musicians never say they have a favorite song, but that is my favorite blog post of all time.
So it looks like you also use it for your own edification and your own confirmation so you can break through the noise and see, because it's factual. I mean, I think some of the stuff you have to be careful with. Like I read your article on the advantage men have in admissions.
Yeah.
And the sense I got from that was the data wasn't really showing it. But then you also pointed out one thing the data can't account for is, are the files stronger from women versus men? And that's important, because that would be something that, being on the sending side, I certainly see this, especially with liberal arts schools that don't have business and engineering, and especially with ones that were formerly women's colleges. So I guess there's times you have to watch that the data doesn't lead somebody in terms of what it says. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. So that was based on an article I read in somewhere online. And the headline, of course, says one thing, that men are being favored in the admissions process. The story said something kind of different, that it looks like maybe that's true. And we talked to someone who did admissions 15 years ago, and she said it was true, which is not really a story. But I always say there's a difference between data and insight. And, I can look at data all day, but as you pointed out, if the files aren't comparable, the fact that one group is getting admitted at a higher rate doesn't really mean anything.
Sure.
Now, I agree. My perception, your perception, the perception of most people is that men have it harder in the admissions process. Men have it easier, in the admissions process, except maybe at places like Caltech, MIT, Case
and
Western.
I would say not even maybe. I'd say that when you have strong engineering programs, you tend to see the opposite gender skew and
computer science, same thing.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at a place like Worcester Polytech. I mean, they reallocated $1 million to female recruitment to try to get to 50-50 and started a women flying program. Some of these institutes are 75-25 in gender.
Exactly. Yeah. It's, so it's almost certainly true. My point is, you can't tell that just by looking at the data. But if you don't do admissions for a living, that might not occur to you. And so that's why I guess one of the themes, the Uber themes of higher ed data stories is, take everything you read with a grain of salt, including what you read on higher ed data stories.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
if I can make a recommended resource,
Yeah, go, Susan. Do it.
Is-
Get one in.
Ron Lieber's other book that's often overlooked because he wrote, the famous The Price You Pay for College,
Yeah.
which is a fabulous book. But one of his earlier books was called The Opposite of Spoiled: Raising Kids Who Are Grounded, Generous, and Smart About Money. And
Wow.
parents, this is a book that will put everything else into perspective for you in terms of, especially if your kids right now are younger, if you're a middle school parent, 9th, 10th grade parent, and you're not ready for The Price You Pay for College or the other kind of gatekeeper style books.
Sure.
But that book talks about long-term emotional well-being and mental well-being of the kids that we're raising, as well as financial well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And those can't be separated. We know what happens when kids are compartmentalized like that. We've got to help them be, grow and be well holistically. So parents, there's the recommended resource. Yes, use the college scorecard. I think it's a incredibly useful resource. You can create your own comparative data sheet of different colleges that you're interested in, and kind of do the, compare the apples to apples. But also take a look at the resources like The Opposite of Spoiled. I think you'll find it really inspirational.
Thank you for that, Susan. And you helped me out. Now I've got to recommend a resource for the week. I can work on next week's one. Now, one of your real interesting posts was your highly rejective colleges one. What can you share with our listeners that you learned from studying the highly rejective colleges? And we have shared that term many times, but we always have new listeners. So you can define it too for them in case someone never heard those episodes.
So I just looked at colleges on two scales. One is their admit rate, or their rejection rate, as you might call it. And then the percentage of their institutional revenue that comes from tuition and fees, right? And my premise for a long time has been that institutions do one of two things, right? They're either better at research or better at instruction. And if a smaller and smaller percentage of your core revenues, which is just the instruction part, comes from student fees, you're less likely to say students are important to us, right? And so what I see is all the big name institutions cluster in what turns out to be the lower left-hand quadrant of this visualization, showing that they're highly rejective, number one, and that student revenue is not very important to their overall budget. And so if student revenue is not important in your overall budget, does that necessarily imply that students are being treated badly? No, but you're not as important as you might be at some other institutions. So it was kind of it's not something anyone should take to the bank or treat seriously. It's one of those, I think, many points that parents and students might not be aware of and might put in their arsenal of things to think about. Choosing a college is sort of like a Monet painting, right? 1,000 little points that add up to a picture, and none of them should be bigger or more important than the other. But this is one of those little points you might want to store away for a future reference.
No, it's great. And I'd love for you to send that link so we can get it in the show notes, and encourage all of our listeners to check out Higher Ed Data Stories. I have to talk to you about test scores, Jon, because that's an area you have a lot of passion on. My question for you, and there's a lot of ways we could go with this, but where do you see things going? I mean, it looks like that the test optional movement at this point has just been completely embraced. I know I interviewed Sam Prouty, the Dean of Admission at Middlebury. And at the time, this was right when the pandemic hit. And this was a school that their statement was, we'll do a 3-year study. So that was their position. But when I asked him if he thought schools would go back to mandatory test scores, so this is now early 2000, he said, do you remember the old phone in the phone booth, that, the manual one that would that you would use back then? He said, that's going to be test scores, in my opinion. You can quote me on that.
Wow. I hadn't heard that. That's an interesting take on it.
But then you have these state systems. Tennessee has recently gone back to mandating. Florida never stopped mandating. Georgia can't make up its mind.
Right.
But other than that, and Georgetown and MIT, like nobody else is currently requiring. And when North Carolina as a state system came out and said they were going test optional, one of the reasons they said is so many of our competitors are that we would be at a competitive disadvantage. So it feels like test scores have now moved away from either something that we think is problematic and too much emphasis is put on it, or something that you can't have access to because of the pandemic, to, wow, we may be at a disservice if we require something that our competitors aren't. And so whatever limited value it has, we can't justify it against the potential loss of applications. So what are your thoughts on where we're headed?
Well, that's a big question. I'll start with a story about a friend of mine who worked at a highly rejective, and he had a young African-American woman that he just loved in the admissions process. Everything about this student, just the file just sang. Every story she told, every essay, every recommendation was glowing. She had a 1290 SAT, and he could not admit her without taking that case to the dean or the vice president. I'm not sure which one. And the vice president said, without a 1300, she's not admissible. And anybody who knows anything about testing, standard error of measure, will tell you there is absolutely, positively no difference between a 1290 and a 1300. None, statistically. Right. And yet that was the hill that vice president was going to die on, the 1300. And that's always been a bone of contention for me. It's not the use of the scores, it's the misuse of the scores.
Sure.
I've had colleagues call me and say, my provost wants to raise our average SAT score by 50 points. What would you do if you were me? And I always say, I'd quit. But if there's something that you need to do, here are the things I guess you could do to change how you count things or how you admit students, if that's really an objective for you. So I think California going test blind is not just the domino we were all waiting for, but the sledgehammer we were waiting for.
Sure.
I did one of my blog posts, I'll send you this one too, is about the importance of California to colleges all across the country.
Yeah.
I think if I remember in 2018, MIT's largest feeder state was California. And if the public universities in California, always one of the shining examples still of access and opportunity in the nation, say we're not even going to consider test scores, my sense is the number of testing locations, the opportunities to take the test will decrease, and that would send a ripple effect through all of higher education. So I was kind of surprised when MIT reinstituted it, although I've heard kind of through the grapevine that it was really some faculty clamoring for the test to come back.
And they have a lot of influence in that admission office. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing is I don't know any admission officer that, I'll take that back. I know one admissions officer who's probably in his late 70s who absolutely loves test scores.
Is he at Georgetown?
No comment. Yes. Yeah. Charlie Deacon is unabashedly a fan of the SAT. And not only that, but the SAT over the ACT. I mean, he's like pro gung-ho SAT.
Yeah.
Very old school. Charlie, I think, has admitted 50 classes at Georgetown. And so, he's been around for a while and he's entitled to his opinion. I disagree with him, but that's fine. But I was in an article or a podcast of This American Life, and where they talked about the campus visit is canceled. It had to do with COVID, and how you recruit students. And the dean of admissions at Yale said, we were really surprised how easy it was to do admissions without test scores. if we just spent a little more time with the application folder. And I thought, well, duh. I
That's what
mean,
you've been saying for a while. Yeah.
I think most admissions officers, again, who are in this business because they like students and they like access to higher education, love being able to evaluate a student without the constraints of those ridiculous, biased test scores. And that's just my personal opinion. I would agree that we're headed toward a time when test scores are going to be less and less important. And Harvard, I think, is test optional through 2026, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Something like that.
That's their college class of 2030, so the high school class of 2026.
Yeah. And, I've said, could you imagine us going out to the universe and saying, well, you got admitted to Harvard and you got admitted to Berkeley, but you still need to take this test to come to Oregon State? I mean, right. I could not imagine saying that with a straight face. I could say that if I were at MIT, I guess, but I couldn't say it at Oregon State. I couldn't say it if I were at Michigan or Virginia or UTA or any of those places. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how MIT and Georgetown are two people that have had their own application. So I think there's a little bit of a track record of some independence there,
Well, vive la différence, right?
Yes. Along your lines of the impact of California, having a conversation with another admission dean, and they said that 15% of their students come from California, and they have noticed a higher percentage of their California applicants are test optional because of what you've said.
Yeah.
And I'm in a couple different counselor groups, and the college counselors in California are saying some of our kids are still having a hard time taking the test because when you go test blind, score free, test free, call it what you want, then you have less test centers and then all of that. And so I think that's likely to be true. Friends, on Monday's episode, we start a brand new interview, and it will be led by Dr. Lisa Ruff, and she will be interviewing Dr. Nick Gozik. So who's Dr. Nick Gozik? Well, he spent a lot of time at Boston College, and when he was at Boston College, he did a number of things. He was involved in being the director of the Office of International Programs at Boston College. He once got a $10 million gift, which he raised, which he turned around and he used so that under-resourced students could have travel grants. And a couple years ago, Elon did a national search, and they ended up selecting him. And so he serves as Elon's Dean of Global Education. And you may know this about Elon, but Elon is known for their incredible study abroad, study away programs. And part of our emphasis now is not only to focus on college admissions, but success in college. And so this will be an interview that Lisa will do with Dr. Nick Gozik on what you need to know about study abroad programs. I think a lot of us in our 40s and 50s look back, and that's our biggest regret about college, is that we never got an opportunity to study abroad, study away, and it just wasn't that popular back then. I don't even remember a single conversation about it. But now it's an incredible, enriching opportunity that I believe every student, if it's at all possible, should take advantage of, because you just don't get those opportunities when you get older. Friends, I want to share a quote with you in closing. So my daughter played basketball, AAU travel basketball, Joy I'm talking about, for 10 years of her life, 7 to 17. And she was on a number of teams, but one team she played for was called Peak Performance. The founder of Peak Performance, a very fine man named Bruce Price, he used to try to close out the practices with all of the young ladies. And he used to say one thing which I want to share with you. And it was this: you all have different abilities, different heights, different sizes, different speeds. But there's one thing you all can control, and that is your attitude and your effort. And friends, if you, and this speaking to adults and students here, if you can get an A+ in attitude and an A+ in effort, you're going to go really far in life, even if you're getting C's or D's in some of your academic courses. See you on Monday, everybody. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.